Welcome to the Darkstream, Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and unauthorized.tv. Thanks for tuning in. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm more than a little bit excited about some of the stuff that seems to be happening. We certainly appear to be living in extremely interesting times. And so, it was fascinating to read the latest Q drop and see a link to a Bloomberg article, of all reasons. I was not expecting to see a Bloomberg article being linked there, but it became very clear why there was a link to it there. And I think that perhaps we can use this to further put some of the recent events into perspective, potentially. Again, we're simply observers. We are not actors. The small fish in the ocean can't control what happens when the whales are doing their thing and the giant squid are doing their thing. But we can observe and we can see the patterns. We can see how things are playing out and reach certain conclusions, which may or may not be correct. And so I'm going to actually address some of these super chats right away because they're tied in. M. Bolster first does his thing. Thank you. Sean Paul sends some Canadian. Thank you in return. Magister Ludi says, to quote Ron Paul, "It's happening." I don't recall Ron Paul saying that, but maybe you can, in the chat, you can put into perspective what you're referring to there. Mr. Gualtieri says, thoughts on the $2 trillion spending bill. I'm going to get to them here in a second. That's why I thought I'd address these first few super chats right from the get-go. And C. Robinson agrees with Mr. G, wants to know my thoughts, and welcome Bill Hicks. So, inflation is inflation down and so forth. The reason that doesn't apply to the United States in the current situation, and again, you can read a very extensive debate on this on my blog between me and between one of my oldest readers, who's also a fan of the Austrian School of Economics. We were debating whether inflation or deflation was more likely. And he's subsequently conceded that particular debate because he was predicting hyperinflation within 2 years. I told him there's no way it was going to happen. And the reason I told him that there's no way it was going to happen, and that the real struggle and what the banks and the Federal Reserve and the IMF and all the various economic mortgage, buy a car, the money is created through the act of taking the loan. And it becomes a asset on the balance sheet. And so, and it's not printed, it's literally created ex nihilo, except for one very important part. You need to have someone taking on that debt. You need to have someone saying, I am the basis for this $10,000. The basis for the $10,000 is not the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. That is what backs the printed money and so forth. What actually backs most of the credit money is you, is me, is people who've taken out a student loan. Now, the government backs a fair amount of it as the lender of last resort, they call it, or as the creditor of last resort is a better way to put it. But like with the student loans are owned by the government. So theoretically, the government would be responsible for it, but the government depends upon all the students paying back as much of it as they can. And so when you run out of people able to take on more debt, you cannot create more debt. This is the problem that economists call pushing on a string. They actually created that phrase in another context. But animatronic is a good question. Why can't they lend money to fake people and keep rolling it over forever? Because eventually people are unwilling. Well, actually, the real reason is they're not willing to lend money to fake people. They're not willing to do it. They need to have some backing somewhere, because if you think about it, it's all about faith and confidence in the end. People have to be willing to accept those debt instruments. Their brilliant solution was to declare that leaves were virtual currency. People who are critics of the system talk about money and the economy as fundamentally being a confidence game. And they don't necessarily mean it in the con man sense, although it's kind of a double entendre. But that's what they're talking about. When they're talking about consumer confidence, why are they always talking about consumer confidence? It's the consumer confidence in the system. And so, hence the term pushing on a string. If you've got a string and you push on the string doesn't move the thing you want to push. The string just, collapses. And that's the problem that they've been in, more or less, since 2008. I mean, I've written extensively about this. I don't even talk about it much anymore or write about it much on the blog because, number one, it's all obvious. I mean, I've written about this and explained this many times on the blog, in my book, Return of the Great Depression. We're still in the same depression that we were in 2008. The GDP statistics don't say that, but the GDP statistics are irrelevant. When you look at the debt numbers, the total credit market debt outstanding, what you'll see is that for 60 years during the post-war period, debt grew at exactly 2.5% per quarter. I mean, it was so close to that precisely that you could just do a line calculating 2.5% per quarter, or you could use the actual statistics, and you would see basically two completely identical lines, identical lines going right up, and in almost perfect parallel. But in 2008, the system broke, and since then, despite all the various efforts of all the king's men and all the king's bankers, they were unable to fix the system. And so the 12 years between 2000, or the 11 years between 2009 and now, has basically been people attempting to pump things up and extricate as much as they can from the system. And so that's the situation that we were in. And that's why I've been totally unconcerned about the impact of the coronavirus on the economy, because the economy is already broken. The economy is already shattered into pieces. And so the event, whatever the event was to make that clear to all and sundry, was irrelevant. Doesn't matter whether, it doesn't matter whether it was war or plague or just a good old-fashioned economic collapse, this was always, always inevitable. And so what's interesting here, so that the $2 trillion package is guaranteed to be completely eaten up by the collapse in debt, the collapse in assets. I mean, think about it. How many loans have you taken out? You know, that's why they're pushing off the collection of income taxes and so forth, because they realize people don't have enough money to pay them. It's not going to happen. You know, we are in a, and what they managed to do was they managed to stem or to hold off the deflation. And so we were actually in a period of what's called credit disinflation, which means that the money supply, the credit money supply, was gradually climbing up a little bit. It just wasn't climbing up enough to actually grow the economy. And so that's credit disinflation means we're successfully kicking the can down the road a little bit, but we haven't fixed anything. And we're going to get to what just recently happened very soon. But you know, while I'm this is all necessary context to truly understand what may be happening. And so in 2008, the system broke. The banks were all bankrupt. The financial institutions were all bankrupt. And they went to the government and said, you need to rescue us. And so what they did is they came up with some special vehicles that essentially combined the Treasury with the Federal Reserve, which was, of course, not legal. And they used that to prop up the system long enough, and Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Chairman, was running it. And so during that brief period of time, Ben Bernanke was essentially controlling the entire U.S. economy. Now, for better or for worse, to his credit, he promptly, as soon as the crisis was passed, as soon as they had managed to keep the institutions afloat, he then reverted the system more or less to the previous system. The Treasury was back fully under the control of the Treasury. So now we have a new situation. And let me finish up. The reason that the $2 trillion stimulus doesn't matter is that the entire money supply of the United States, $2 trillion, is essentially a drop in the bucket. You need to compare it. You need to compare that $2 trillion to the figure of M2, which is the amount of money that's actually out there being exchanged, and then you need to compare it to the total amount of credit outstanding, which is in the 80 trillion range. So $2 trillion being given out to people to spend money or buy things or whatever else it's being given out for, and a lot of it won't be spent, because people are going to save it and whatnot. It's not going to cause hyperinflation. It's not even going to cause inflation. It's not even going to stop the deflation. And you can see the deflation in the falling prices of everything from assets to gasoline to gold. The cash is becoming more valuable because it's becoming more scarce. Remember, debt is used to buy things, so therefore debt is money. Debt affects the supply-demand curve. It's very simple. If you have a house for sale and I've saved up $100,000 and I am going to pay you the $100,000 for the house, okay, so that's the value of the house, right? 100,000. Supply and demand. We've got the intersection, right? Perfect. But then let's say animatronic gets a loan from a banker. He doesn't have any money, but the banker says, hey, I will loan you $150,000 to buy that house. Well, what happens? He buys the house. The owner, of course, says, hey, I would rather sell the house to this guy. He's going to give me $150,000. I can not only buy another house, but I can buy a pickup truck too. And so the price of the house inflates. The price of the house is now $150,000, even though without the debt, without the creation of that credit money, I would have bought it for $100,000. So, so that's why the $2 trillion is not an issue. Now let's get to the interesting part. We haven't even gotten to the interesting part yet. Okay, so the interesting part is what was just announced. Q came out with this pretty recently, a couple hours ago, and he linked to a piece on Bloomberg. And the piece on Bloomberg, and I'll put the link in the chat here so that you can see it. It's really fascinating, although it's pretty dry. The Fed's cure risks being worse than the disease. Okay. The economic debate of the day centers on whether the cure of an economic shutdown is worse than the disease of the virus. Similarly, we need to ask if the cure of the Federal Reserve getting so deeply into corporate bonds, asset-backed securities, commercial paper, and exchange-traded funds is worse than the disease seizing financial markets. It may be. And what they're talking about is they're talking about the Federal Reserve getting involved into kinds of debt that it is not normally involved with. And in fact, it's not even allowed to in some cases. In just these past few weeks, the Fed has cut rates by 150 basis points to near zero and run through its entire 2008 crisis handbook. Right, this is a bigger crisis than 2008 already. And keep in mind, not only is this not a surprise, I warned everybody about this. I wrote in January that 2020 is 2008. I said the financial crisis will happen later this year. I didn't expect it in 2 months, but it was obvious that it was coming. That wasn't enough to calm markets, though. So the central bank also announced $1 trillion a day in repurchase agreements and unlimited quantitative easing, which includes a hard-to-understand $625 billion of bond buying a week going forward. At this rate, the Fed will own 2/3 of the Treasury market in a year. So what they're saying there is that the Fed is buying up the government debt. And they're also buying other forms of debt. It's the alphabet soup of new programs that deserve special consideration, as they could have profound long-term consequences for the functioning of the Fed and the allocation of capital in financial markets. Specifically, I'm not going to bother with all the acronyms. Buying commercial paper from the issuer, buying corporate bonds from the issuer, funding backstop for asset-backed securities, buying corporate bonds and bond ETFs in the secondary market. Details are to come, but it will lend to eligible small and medium-sized businesses, complementing efforts by the Small Business Administration. To put it bluntly, the Fed is not allowed to do any of this. The central bank is only allowed to purchase or lend against securities that have government guarantees. This includes security treasuries, agency mortgage-backed securities, and the debt issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In other words, it was set up so that the Fed couldn't possibly lose. It was set up so that no matter what happened, the debt that it played in was going to be guaranteed by the federal government. Now they're suddenly getting into unsecured debt, which, as we mentioned before, is something that the bankers never, ever, ever want to do. So how can they do this? The Fed will finance a special purpose vehicle, SPV, for each acronym to conduct these operations. The Treasury will make an equity investment in each SPV and be in a first loss position. What does this mean? In essence, the Treasury, not the Fed, is buying all of these securities and backstopping of loans. The Fed is acting as banker and providing financing. The Fed hired BlackRock Inc. to purchase these securities and handle the administration of the SPV on the behalf of the owner, the Treasury. So the Treasury is going to own all this debt, and it's using the Fed as a vehicle. In other words, the federal government is nationalizing large swathes of the financial markets. The Fed is providing the money to do it. BlackRock will be doing the trades. This scheme essentially merges the Fed and the Treasury into one organization. So meet your new Fed chairman, Donald J. Trump. Now this is where the interesting part, it becomes very clear. In 2008, when something similar was done, it was on a smaller scale. Since few understood it, the Bush and Obama administrations ceded total control of these acronym programs to then Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke. He unwound them at the first available opportunity. But now, 12 years later, we have a much better understanding of how they work. And we have a president who has made it very clear how displeased he is that central bankers haven't used their considerable power to force asset prices higher, and so forth. So what appears to be happening, and I say appears because there's two ways that this could go. I mean, either Trump is calling the shots, or the Fed will be calling the shots, right? We don't know who. But it appears they believe that the merger of those two, the practical merger of those two organizations means that the president will be calling the shots. And this is certainly harmonious with our understanding of what is happening with regards to other things relating to the various conspiracy theories out there, including the coronavirus. And so we don't know, we can't know, but it looks as if the banks went and the Fed went to the president and said, the whole system's going to collapse. Everything is going to collapse. So you need to give us these tools and give us this power in order to keep the system from collapsing. And I'm just guessing on the basis of that Bloomberg article. You know, this is not my imagination. This is not wishful thinking. This is just my straight up analysis on the basis of that article and my understanding of the weaknesses of the financial system. It is my guess that the president called their bluff. I suspect that the God Emperor said, fine, let it collapse. The system's broken. You blew it again, twice in 12 years. Let it fall, let it collapse, let it burn. And they said, you know, well, won't you do anything? And then I suspect that, you know, remember, he's the guy who literally wrote the book on negotiating. Nobody is a better negotiator that I've seen than Donald Trump, except for maybe Vladimir Putin. But I'm not sure Putin just negotiates. He seems to act a little bit more like the Godfather, you know, make you an offer you really don't want to refuse. So it's going to be interesting to see if that interpretation is the correct one, or the alternative is, well, the Fed owns the government. Well, how would that be any different than it's been for the past 70, 80 years. Or, technically, I guess, 100 something. But the point is that it appears that the good guys are in control, that we can trust the plan, and that there is a reasonable chance that we are going to come out of this much better off than we were before going into the crisis. We may be coming out of this with Americans getting their nation back, at least getting their wallet back. We'll have to see. I mean, again, I'm not promising anything. I'm not saying that this take is correct. My information is woefully incomplete. I have virtually no information on this. I am basing this perception on a single article written by Bloomberg, right? But we can as with all things, once we have an observation and once we have a hypothesis, we can start to build a predictive model about this. So what's the predictive model? The predictive model is we should start seeing incredible complaints about Trump having too much power over Wall Street. We should start seeing lots of resistance. We should start seeing the financial media recommending investing in foreign assets. And we should see the stock market probably begin rising steadily. I'm not saying you should invest on any of these things. I'm just saying that these would be indications that of objective measures, of objective observations that would tend to confirm what we're seeing. In the same way, how do we know that Trump is correct about his Trump pills? The whole hydrochloride or whatever it is, the malaria-related drugs. How do we know he's correct about that? Because of the absolutely unprecedented interference and resistance by people that we know to be involved with evil. We know these Democratic governors are controlled creatures. They have no opinion on medicine. That woman who's the governor of Michigan, she probably knows less about medicine than my dog. But the fact that she would leap in to interfere with that is because obviously somebody told her to. Why? Because it's very clear that the deep state does not want Donald Trump to succeed. And so we're going to see all sorts of, for something that is potentially this significant, there is no way that we are not going to see massive amounts of media resistance, deep state resistance, and so forth. If we see it, we'll know what's happening. If we don't see it, possibly not. So, but I think that this is a reason to be cautiously optimistic. I think this is a reason to believe that the probabilities are beginning to favor the onset of the storm. It hasn't been announced yet. We've already been told how it will be announced if it's announced. But we are seeing not only definite signs that events are moving in that direction, we're seeing signs of things that we had never imagined. If you had asked me 2 months ago that nations would have closed their borders, and that gas prices would be falling to the levels that they've fallen to, and that the Fed had been effectively nationalized. I mean, I wouldn't have even believed it would be possible. And yet here we are. And so, there's nothing to be afraid of in this. This is all very, very potentially wonderful news. 3/7 notes that Trump just authorized troop activation with an executive order today. Yeah, I saw that too. That's just another indication. It's just another indication. And so pray for the man. Pray for Donald Trump and pray for his success, and pray that America will be free again, that America will be America again. And so, this is very exciting. It's very interesting, and I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to be able to witness this and see how this is coming to pass over time. It's certainly been a fascinating ride, and I'll keep watching, I'll keep reading, and if I'm wrong, I'll tell you. I have no problem whatsoever admitting that my interpretations are wrong. It happens. All we can do is make the best call that we can make on the information that we have. My information is so incomplete as to barely exist at all. And so, I don't want you to be saying, oh, well, Vox says this is going to happen. No, Vox is just saying that the events that are taking place do appear to be increasingly in line with the events predicted by some of the conspiracy theorists, especially those related to Q. And that's all we can say at this point in time. I would encourage you, if you haven't read it yet, I'd encourage you to look into Neon Revolt's book on Q. It's the best book out there on the subject. And, it will definitely deepen your understanding of some of the stuff that's going on. When one thing's for certain, you can, doubt the legitimacy or the reality of Q and so forth. But what you can't deny is that it has proven to be a much more effective indicator of future events than anything you read in the mainstream media. So let's get to the other super chats here. Hedda is quite generous. Thank you. Are deflation and the USD becoming worthless, impossible simultaneously? Yes, deflation usually will tend to mean that the US dollar will become more valuable. Welcome, Carnaby. And welcome, Bill Hicks. Josh says, does Corona fallout open a window for Australia or New Zealand to restrict immigration, repatriate enough to avoid becoming total Chinese colonies? Theoretically, but the military situation makes it very difficult. If China ever decides it wants to take Australia or New Zealand, it will. The good news is China is not really, does not appear to be that interested in that. They're much more interested in Africa, as far as I can tell. Paul Longbear says, God bless you for the info you condensed for us. Thank you. I appreciate that. Submitted to Christ says, thank you for the ladles of gravy today, Vox. You're quite welcome. And no, don't worry. My throat's dry from talking. That's all. Hey, Vox, thanks for the gravy. I'm loving Social Galactic. Congrats on getting your dad back home. God bless. Yeah, it's really fun. I really enjoyed having the chance to talk to him. It's been good. Welcome Sun Bear, welcome Tundra Bear. Canadian99 says, "Hey Vox, if your guess is right about this, what impact do you think it will have on other currencies markets?" It's too soon to say. Now it's too soon hard to predict anything, but I'd love to hear your early thoughts. I've just learned about this, so I wouldn't want to answer that right now. Hang on. All right. Well, I'm going to let you go while I can still talk. But read the article, pay attention, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Social Galactic. I'm Voxday. This is the Darkstream.